It is my pleasure to introduce the panel we have here. I'm actually just going to introduce our modifier, Jennifer Bushman. Jennifer Bushman is an ambassador for sustainable seafood culture. She has been working to bring together a number of companies all interested in creating sustainable culinary culture, and she's going to talk about that. We're going to ask some questions, and then we're going to have an amazing sustainable lunch. Thank you all for being here. Here's Jen Bushman.
Hey, everybody. It's really great to be here. I feel a little bit like I've been a part of this culinary journey with Chef's Roll, and certainly bringing together as part of the contextual conversation our water farmers and our sustainable seafood sourcing. And I want to say something to start with. I had a whole introduction planned and then enrolled the swordfish. And what I realized was there's something about fish and seafood that creates this visceral reaction. And we actually, as a culinary community, are very, very connected to what comes from this bounty of the ocean. And what's interesting to me about where we are in terms of this time and place in which we're sourcing from the ocean and we're rearing from the ocean is that you actually are in a very unique state. You know, years ago, whether it was in the 70s or the 80s, we could actually be catalysts of change in farming, right? So what you put on your menu, what sort of provenance you showed about where the farm was or where the farmer came from. You had a unique opportunity to connect not just with what was happening in the back of the house and in the front of the house, but also pushed all the way out into the streets with the way in which consumers started to source and think about that provenance. So all of a sudden, it wasn't just cool to talk about where the corn came from, but really to tell that farmer's story. I think that we were inspired in the beginning maybe by the wine industry, because nothing tells the story of provenance like the wine industry does. And then out of it came the rest of our community. Whether it was our land-based farmers, our terrestrial farmers, or vegetables, or produce, or fruit, we felt connected. And it was your being the catalyst for change that created that connection that made me walk into the grocery store and say, hey, you know what? I care about where my food comes from. And there was an incredible thing that happened. What we realized was there was value in it. So it wasn't just that you were doing the right thing as this catalyst for change. It was also that you were creating more value out of your menu item. Because we know that when your guest understands where the food came from, they're willing to pay as much as 30% more for it. Where does your food come from? So one of the interesting turning points and a place where we really feel like, depending on how you champion it and in which way it intersects with you personally, you have a chance right now to be a catalyst for change in one of the most important food conversations that we are having. And that has to do with that guy. The oceans are the last wild frontier. We still feel as if it's ingrained in our culture, ingrained in our DNA, and you're going to hear about it today, that we have a right to go out and harvest the ocean. Now, what's interesting to me is that when a guest sits down in your restaurant, they don't ask you if you wild shot your ribeye, because the last time you went out and wild hunted cows, I don't think actually ever happened. But yet, every time they sit down, they ask if your fish and seafood is wild or farmed. The dynamic is changing. Our oceans are 90% fished out. How we manage fisheries, how we as restaurateurs and restaurant groups and buyers and chefs intersect with where fish and seafood comes from. The balance between what's reared sustainably and what's caught sustainably is really what's going to provide this resource for future generations. So today I'm really excited. One, because I think I'm just kind of the conduit to starting a conversation, because I already know how you feel about this, because when he rolled out on the stage, it didn't even matter what these guys were talking about, you know, your future television and social media careers. All of your phones went over here. You love this. It's sexy, it's a beautiful animal. And now we want to talk about how we make sure we have it and what that journey is and how you can have a voice in that and how hard it is. Because probably unlike most of the sourcing you do, this one is going to be the one that we need you to be the most engaged with, but it's also the one that's probably going to cause you the most pain. So today I have really an incredible group of panelists that are going to touch all levels of the food chain. Because as I told you before, there's not one straight road in this right now with fish and seafood. There's a lot of different players in it, and you're going to have to figure out what your voice is in it. So we're going to start off first and foremost with an incredible advocate and a dear friend of mine. I want to introduce you to Barton Seaver. Barton is a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America. If you don't know who he is, it's probably a bit of a surprise because Barton actually has opened 7 restaurants based in the DC area. He was named a Rising Star Chef. He was named Chef of the Year by Esquire magazine. But as he was sourcing for his restaurants, he realized exactly what he wanted and the stories he wanted to tell through fish and seafood because it was so deeply ingrained in him and in his childhood. And as he did, what it meant was that his career really pivoted. So although he's still very steeped in the kitchen, part of his journey also was at Harvard and as a Nat Geo explorer. And now beyond that, talking to groups like Google and Delaware North and others about how to source sustainably in reared and harvested fish and making sure that we're on that right path. So I bring to you the esteemed Barton Seaver. Thank you for joining us. Our next presenter is Julie Kuchepatov. Julie actually has not only been on the wild side of things in Russian fisheries and sourcing, but I think probably some of your most important work is what you're doing now. Julie is the director of seafood for Fair Trade USA. Now, a lot of you know that you're already sourcing fair trade coffee. You're probably well aware of the fair trade symbol on chocolate, but one of the most important things that we feel now about championing fish and seafood is not just that there's an environmental standard, but that we can't thrive and have true sustainability unless communities thrive. There are more than 4.6 million boats in the water right now that are harvesting the sea. And what Julie does every single day is make sure that there are engaged producers and fishers, both coming on the aquaculture side as well as on the wild side, making sure that the communities and those fishers are getting an equitable part of that distribution channel. So she's going to talk to you today about that. I also have on the panel Chris Cumming, and I think he's a very important piece of this experience for you. Because farmed fish is your future. And if we don't figure out how to do farming right, both in the water environmentally, as well as the feed that we source, and all of the ecosystem around it, as well as you sourcing it and knowing what to look for in sustainably raised fish, we're going to be lost because the oceans can't keep up. Chris is actually the national sales manager for Pacifico Aquaculture, the beautiful striped bass you're going to have today. And so we welcome Chris Cumming. And then finally, you know, supply chain is very confusing in fish and seafood. As a matter of fact, they say that fish and seafood changes hands more times than any other thing you source, on average 9 times. And so we have to have this very, very specific mid-market supply chain that ensures that what you think you're ordering, you actually are getting. And so I introduce to you Shevis Shima, who has had an incredible career in fish and seafood, both here in the region, in San Diego with Chesapeake Seafood, and then upon the purchase of that by Santa Monica Seafood, to ultimately become the Vice President of Sales for Santa Monica Seafood. So we welcome Shevis to also tell this other part of the story. So we're going to hit you on all levels. We hope that you're going to be engaged, and we really want you to be thinking about your questions, because let me tell you, it is a fishy business. And we know that it is confusing, and we're hoping this is going to be an engaged dialogue with your voice in it too, or we haven't done our jobs. So at the end, when we ask for questions, we're hoping that you get there. So where we're going to start actually is at the source. We're going to have Chris come up. He's going to speak for a few minutes specifically about what they're doing for Pacifico Aquaculture and the steps that they're making in order to make sure that the fish you think you're getting is coming from point A to point B properly. So Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Hopefully you'll cue up the slide, guys, for Chris. Just take 1 second.
There we go. So, as Jennifer mentioned, my name's Chris Cumming. I'm the Senior Sales Manager for Pacifico Aquaculture. I handle sales for the USA and Canada. Through this presentation today, I'm going to take you on a little journey through Isla Todos Santos Island, which is where our farm is located, which is just about 89 miles where we are, or south of where we are right now. So this is Dan Farag and Omar Elfi, our co-CEOs. They were stuck in the world of finance years ago and were unhappy with what they were doing and really wanted to change and get involved with something that would make an impact. They identified the need for sustainable protein in this world, and through raising money through family and friends, took over a struggling aquaculture farm in Baja, which is Pacifico Aquaculture, which is the world's only true ocean-raised striped bass. So the journey for this farm took them down a path that they really had no idea where it was going to take them, or far beyond what they could have imagined. Pacifico striped bass is a very unique fish, being the only ocean-raised striped bass in the world. Site selection is really important. So choosing the site where you're going to grow your farm is incredible to protect the health of the fish and the health of the planet and the health of the ocean. Isla Todos Santos Island is actually a protected bird sanctuary. So we work in conjunction with the Mexican government in order to operate here. Our farmers actually act as stewards of the island. We're the only ones allowed on the island, except for a couple times out of the year when conservationists come on during the bird nesting periods. Our farm is 8 miles offshore and is really one of the most unique, incredible open ocean farms in the world. Strong currents, very deep water, offer ideal conditions for ocean farming. When you're on the farm site itself, you'll actually see lots of marine life, seals, sea lions, and you'll see that it's a really thriving environment. Years and years ago, wild fishing industry in this region was really struggling. The wild fish have been overfished, the wild stocks have been depleted, which left wild fishermen and their families out of jobs. Pacifico is actually able to re-employ a lot of these families that have been in the fishing industry for generations. Now, Pacifico is a very thriving economy, has really brought fishing back into the industry in Baja, and really is a, sorry, let me catch up on my notes. So, I'm waiting for my next slide. I apologize. So our water farmers, most of them are all from this region. They grew up in the area. They spend a lot of time in the water, surfing, diving, fishing, and keeping the water quality is very important to them. This is Jan. Jan is actually our hatchery manager. So our team is really a dedicated, very passionate group of individuals that are really masters of their craft. Our hatchery is actually an old tuna canning factory that had gone out of business, and we are able to revitalize it. So this is our feed. Our feed is a marine protein-based diet. It's how you source fish meal is one of the most important things when you're talking about sustainability in aquaculture. We use fish meal that comes from trimmings from the Canadian pollock and hake fisheries, trimmings that would otherwise go to waste, that we incorporate into our fish. The rest of the fish meal is sourced from MSC certified fisheries. Thoughtful farming really comes down to a few key components. We don't use any chemicals, no antibiotics in our fish, nothing that's going to be harmful to the environment or to the fish itself. What you get in the end from thoughtful rearing is a fish that's long and slender, has very tight scales, fully developed fins, very firm flesh, clear eyes. These are all indicators of a healthy fish that was brought up right, that was raised right in a healthy way. The fish itself is very high in omega-3s. When cooking, you'll notice when you put it in a pan, when you're pan-searing it, it'll really retain all those oils. There's nothing worse than when you put a fish in the pan-sear it, and you see all the oil starting to come out of the fish. You lose the moisture and you lose the flavor. A healthy fish won't do that to you. Pacifico is very versatile. Sashimi grade fish. Chefs can really use their creativity to create many beautiful, thoughtful dishes that will really help tell the story of the fish. Chefs, you can really create a story with your plate. You can create a sense of provenance, where that fish came from. You can connect your consumer or your guest with the story of the fish, with the people and the culture and the community that helped raise it for 2 to 3 years. So, our fish is revered by some of the best chefs in the world. Thomas Keller, Rick Bayless, Enrique Olvera. These are the type of chefs that use our fish, and they know that they're not only using a high-quality fish that they can feel confident serving to their guests, but they know it's a product that came from, made an impact in its community and an impact in the industry. So Pacifico is continuing to build a legacy through thoughtful leaders and continuing to put Baja on the map as a hub for sustainable aquaculture. That is it.
So the idea that these water farmers are producing solutions, right? Because we know at present that the wild striper population on the East Coast is actually going down, and the amount that we're going to be allowed to fish from there is starting to be depleted. Over the course of the next 2 to 3 years, you're going to see what you have available to you, particularly out on the East Coast, start to go down. So it's the farmer's work. I don't know if you caught this with Chris, but it's the farm's work with those wild stocks that in a lot of ways end up actually helping the fishers. So did you hear him? I mean, there are 200 employees, the majority of which had actually fished out their tuna fishery that are now working for Pacifico. So I want to talk about community impact. Julie, you're up next. Let's talk about how we don't just make an impact on the environment, because we have to do what's right in these wild fisheries as well as on the farm, but how do we make sure that things are sustainable for communities?
Is that a question for me now, or can I just... I'm waiting for my PowerPoint to come up. Yeah, that's what I'm going to be talking about.
Yep. So go ahead and bring up Julie's slides, please.
Oh, thanks. Sorry, Jennifer. I didn't know who we were talking about. Thanks, Jennifer. So my name is Julie Kuchepatov, and I'm the Seafood Director at Fairtrade USA. As she mentioned, you might be familiar with Fairtrade coffee or tea, but we also certify seafood. And prior to joining Fairtrade about 3 years ago, I worked for more than a decade with Russian salmon fisheries, getting them into sustainability improvements, environmental sustainability improvements. And this is what happened in one of the fisheries that I worked with. So this is a pile of dead fish. Obviously, the environmental degradation here is clear and obvious. But really, you know, there are people doing this. This didn't just happen. So there are people standing behind this activity. And to me, focusing on the environment is not enough. We need to expand the definition of what is sustainable to include social responsibility and economic viability and livelihoods. And that's where fair trade comes in. So our mission is to enable sustainable development and community empowerment by cultivating a more equitable global trade model that benefits fishers, farmers, consumers, and ultimately the earth. And so we certify fishermen, fishing communities, and the products that they produce. And currently we certify wild capture fisheries. And these are most of them here, you can see. And some of them you will be enjoying at lunch today. But we also are piloting an aquaculture program this year, so I'm really excited to expand the definition to be a true seafood program. Getting back to the full definition of what is sustainability and environmental stewardship, social responsibility, and economic viability and livelihoods. Environmental stewardship is obviously a very important part. So we have robust standards that look at the stocks and harvest methods. What are the conditions of the stocks? How does the fishing affect the ecosystem? What kind of gear is used? Our criteria look at all of that stuff just to make sure that nothing is happening adversely in the fishery. What is bycatch if their marine mammals are being inadvertently harmed by the fishery? Of course, this is a recent photo of a whale that washed up with a bunch of ocean plastics in its body. We do have waste management criteria, which is actually quite unique, I think, for sustainable seafood certifications. We don't want a certified fishery to contribute to this issue on the planet. It's actually really dire. So the second bucket of our expanded definition of sustainability is social responsibility. And slave labor, forced labor, child labor in seafood supply chains has become increasingly more, kind of the spotlight has been shown on this. So fair trade, our criteria, not only look at the fishermen and the farmers on the ground and how their working conditions, but also in the first or the primary processing level. So we look at how are they contracted? What are their wages like? What are their working conditions? Are they safe? Do they have fire extinguishers, that kind of stuff. Safety on water is also a very important component. Fishing is a tough job, and you guys have probably all seen Deadly Catch. We want to make sure that the fishermen are safe, they have navigational tools, they have safety equipment, the vests and all that stuff. So, and even in fish farms as well, we're going to look at that. So another big component in the social piece is this organization of fishers and farmers. So fishermen, this isn't all about empowerment. So they are empowered to make decisions for the good of their fishery and their community by this organizational component. So they're organized into co-ops or fishing associations, and I'll speak to more about that in this third bucket, which is the economic prosperity and livelihoods component of our expanded definition of sustainability. So that pile of dead fish, we want to know why people went and did that. It is because of lack of economic opportunities? Probably. And they're all very closely related. So fair trade, the coolest thing about it is this empowerment piece. So for each pound of fair trade certified seafood sold, community development funds are generated and given back to those co-ops or fishing associations so they can spend that money for the good of their fishery or the good of their community. And I'm proud to say that thus far, $1.25 million in additional income has been generated and given back to these communities. They've spent it on school uniforms, air conditioning in schools, grieving funds for fishermen who are lost at sea, et cetera, lots of stuff. 30% of that community development funds, or the CDF, must be spent on environmental projects. So the fair trade model really dovetails nicely with existing environmental sustainability initiatives. They have spent this money on increased monitoring and enforcement in their fisheries and turtle, habitat mitigation, so for turtles, et cetera. So fair trade really is a holistic approach to impact and embracing that new definition of sustainability. So I'm going to transition here to what you can do. And Yeah, so think about the enlarged definition of sustainability. So what can you do? You can demand fair trade certified seafood or sustainable seafood from your suppliers. And you might say, I'm just going to stick to local seafood. Well, that might be the case, but believe me, so many issues happen in US-based fisheries, just in global fisheries. And of course, 90% of seafood is imported into the U.S. So either way, you're gonna come with you're gonna deal with imported seafood. So fair trade is actually on your customers' radars. Our logo has 63% consumer recognition in the U.S. So the minute you put that logo on your menu, you will generate the impact that generates the funds that goes back to the community, that generates the impact on the water. Finally, use your voice, use your power, your celebrity to educate your consumers and your colleagues. And we've seen what you can do as a community when you get behind and rally behind an issue. So this is an all hands on deck moment. And it is going to take, to create change that we want to see in global seafood supply chains, it's going to take everyone on board, from the fisherman to the farmer to the mid-supply chain to the chef to the consumer to the retailer. You will try some seafood at lunch. Thank you. I'm Julie Kuchepatov from Fair Trade USA.
Absolutely amazing. I mean, we're starting to see a greater and greater role from the NGOs, right? Whether it's Oceana, whether it's Environmental Defense Fund. For those of us in the kitchen, we're looking at James Beard's Smart Catch, Seafood Watch. I mean, it is a huge ocean of almost certification, sustainability schemes, and what do we participate in and what don't we? And one of the things I don't want to be missed about fair trade is, although it's a young program, think of what coffee looked like at the beginning. Nobody was talking about what was happening on those coffee plantations with those workers until fair trade got involved. That's the kind of amplification that you can make it by being able to put something like fair trade, the logo, on that menu item, and knowing that automatically from listing it that way, that then the consumer is gonna, or your guest is gonna immediately recognize it. It's not easy though. And part of it is, you know, we are not buying direct. Fish and seafood has a very, very complicated supply chain, which means who you buy from, even in as much as you want to buy from the littlest supplier all the way to the largest, you have to be engaged consumers. You know, if Seafood Watch is asking us to ask where your fish and seafood came from as consumers and to use the app, it's that much more important for you to not just believe your buddy who's been selling to you all along that that happens to be where the fish came from. You've got to get it from remarkable partners. And so one of those partners I want you to hear from, because this is so important, is Shevis. And Shevis, actually, what Santa Monica Seafood is doing so that it makes it easier for you to engage in Smart Catch and make sure that you're tracing your fish and seafood sourcing amongst all of the other kind of mechanisms they do. I want you to hear about what Santa Monica is putting in place and how they do business every day to make sure that this guy came from a sustainable fishery and was actually supplied in a sustainable way. Shevis.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good morning, everyone. All right, Santa Monica Seafood. So established back in 1939, since the inception of the company, the family has made a commitment to sustainability and food safety. On the bottom right-hand corner there, that's our sales staff. We have an army of salespeople to educate all of you as chef, F&B, front of the house, back of the house, so you can then convey that message all the way down to the end consumer. I tried to find a better looking guy for this shot, but I couldn't. Yes, that's me holding a white sea bass. This is right here on our dockside location in downtown San Diego called Chesapeake Fish Company. Santa Monica has strategically placed ourselves in 2 locations to where we can really support our local fisheries. Up in the Central Coast of California, as well as down here in San Diego. These are some of our local fishermen that are moored here in Tuna Harbor, right by our Chesapeake facility. This is probably the best slide that I put on this entire deck. Reason for it, in the last 30 years, commercial fishing has not been a cool thing to do, right? Today, the youth, the young, the new generation is getting excited about commercial fishing. It's a trendy thing. It's a cool thing to do now, thanks to all the social media and thanks to all of you and your support. As I said earlier, Santa Monica Seafood, we always stayed at the forefront of sustainability. These are just some of the organizations and groups that we work hand in hand with and we're firm supporters of. Santa Monica Seafood, we were the first distributor to have a formal partnership with the Monterey Bay Aquarium and their Seafood Watch program. We're also the first and only supplier in the country to have what we call our RSVP program, which I'll get into on another slide. This is our Seafood Watch program. This is how we can generate best practices for the culinary side of things. We can grade each invoice. Each and every line on your invoice from Santa Monica Seafood will have a Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch rating. RSVP, this is something we're very proud of. Responsible Sourcing Vendor Partnership. Basically what this stands for is we take a percentage of our proceeds on an annual basis to invest back into the industry to create an actual sustainable culture. These are some of the requirements, objectives, and parameters that we go by when investing into RSVP projects. Aquaculture improvement, community development, education, fishery management, gear improvement, IUU, as well as stock enhancement programs. This is a little pie graph of where the investments has gone on a percentage basis. You can see the breakdown there on the graph on the right-hand side. These are some of the projects that we've invested in over the last 3 years. We created the RSV program back in 2009. Very proud of it. As you can see on the top right-hand corner, we looked at stock assessments for our California halibut fishery, as well as our California white sea bass fishery. We partnered with Hub's SeaWorld Research Institute. We invested money to enhance their research in trying to find out what the stock assessments looked like and what the sustainable future looked like for the fishery. I presume most chefs at this event has had this product. This was a test fishery that started a few years back. It's called deep set buoy gear. The reason why this test fishery was started off is because we wanted to target the primary species and minimize the bycatch. We've been very successful in doing so, and this year this will become an actual commercial fishery. 98% of the catch, of the landings from the test fishery was the primary target. 98%. The other 2% would have been your bycatch, your thresher shark, your OPA. Yes, Tommy Gomes, OPA. That's the 2%, and obviously all of this is consumable and brought to the marketplace. This is another interesting RSVP project for us. We invested money into the Peruvian mahi fishery. A lot of illegal fishing going on out there, so we wanted to actually have a pilot traceability program so we could see where exactly the activity was happening. Ironic that Ready Seafood's on my slides today because I had a sales meeting yesterday and they did a phenomenal presentation. Ready Seafood is based out of Maine and they are vertically integrated. They do a tremendous job in assessing the fishery but also improving the stocks. Ready Seafood has received some grants from the University of Maine to better understand the growth period between the larval stages to market size. Market size meaning 1 pound lobsters. It takes 5 to 8 years for a 1 pound lobster to get to that size. This will be part of our RSVP initiative in 2019. ISO 14001, very proud of this certification. This is something that we've been accredited with based on our best practices from a processing and distribution standpoint. We want to keep a minimal environmental footprint so we can preserve our oceans, our lakes, our rivers, and everything that comes out of it. From a processor standpoint, It's not sustainable unless there is food safety and quality that follows. We take food safety very seriously. FSSC 22000 is a very global renowned certification for food safety. Santa Monica Seafood is the only company in the world to have ISO 14001, as well as FSSC 22000 certifications. And that's our 6 shareholders. They made a promise, and they made a commitment, and they came through very well. Shevis, Shima, Santa Monica Seafood.
So, I mean, I think I want to make sure that you all understand, we know that you're coming from a lot of different regions, different areas. It's not just about what Santa Monica is doing. It's also about the power of understanding what you should be demanding. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, because whether it's a group of chefs that changed the way that Seattle Fish is doing invoicing in Denver because of what they were demanding that Smart Catch wanted from them through the James Beard Foundation and others. So the information is really important, that you're not just looking at this transactionally, but you're demanding this on your invoicing, so you're always following that fish. So you know where he came from, literally from ocean to plate. So with that, I want to bring Barton Seaver to the table here, because Barton not only is a champion for proper sourcing of fish and seafood, but also talking about why does it only hold such a small place on your menu, and the impacts that we need to have, because here's what we know for sure. The UN has said that the 71% of the world, which is our oceans and waterways, is going to supply you with the most sustainable protein as we get to 10 billion on the planet. So looking at what Barton's doing in terms of the way you're reshaping your menu is significantly important. So Barton, come up and talk to us.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. I have the awesome pleasure to talk, as Jennifer was saying, really about why seafood matters, what its place is in the context of our business of ultimately sustaining ourselves as business people, but also, very importantly, sustaining our guests. Ultimately, the idea of sustainability can be very complicated. The politic of sustainability can seem nearly impossible. But the action of sustainability is what we do every single day. It's acting as a neighbor. It's taking care of each other, thinking about all of those in the circle of our impact. So as we talk about chefs as catalysts, I think it's important that we take a step back and think about what catalyst is meant to achieve. You know, oftentimes I think we get onto a momentum, we get into an idea without constantly revisiting the fact of what is it that we want to achieve. And for me, my path took me down a journey where what I want to achieve is more people eating more seafood across all demographics. Full stop. My path started in restaurants. I ran restaurants with Jose Andres for a while, learned from him that a chef is more than the sum of the ingredients she, he, they put on a plate. I then became very interested in that larger impact of what my purchasing did. So I went out, I had an opportunity to become an explorer for National Geographic. I mean, holy shit, that is a sexy job. And I went out into the world thinking, as this sort of white man, that I had the answers to reduce the impact that we have on marine ecosystems. And I very quickly learned that my perspective is not the one that matters, but rather the ultimate purpose and the result of sustainability is the endurance of thriving human communities. And that ultimately it's not about minimizing our impact on oceans, but maximizing their impact upon us. I began to look at seafood through the macro lens of public health. And that's where I began to understand that seafood itself, as a category, is the innovation that we as chefs will use to drive sustainability. As a category, it is what we must focus on. And there's reasons for why I want more Americans, more everyone, eating more seafood across all demographics. It's because it will save lives. It will improve the relationship we have with our environment, and it will revolutionize economic opportunity. I mean, that sounds like pretty big, high, blue sky thinking, but it's true. And I'll prove to you why. So in my research and in my, when I was teaching at Harvard in the medical school and public health, I worked a lot with the researchers who were doing the frontline understanding and begin to evolve what we think about seafood. Listen to these facts. The #1 cause of death in America is cardiovascular disease. By 2035, it's estimated that 1 in 2 Americans will suffer from it. But eating seafood twice a week, like our own government and health experts recommend, will reduce cardiac mortality incidences by 36%. Eating seafood twice per week will decrease overall mortality by 17%. Extrapolate that out, I mean, these are just kind of percents and figures. That's actually 55,000 American lives every year, simply by eating seafood. Chefs, this is a moral issue. It also happens to be a delicious one. And how cool is that? But also, seafood categorically has a lower environmental impact. The problem is we often think of sustainable seafood simply through the guise of seafood itself. Is this green or is this red? But we don't look at it as the center of the plate protein, because if we're not putting seafood on that plate, what are we putting? We're putting beef, pork, chicken, lamb. And across all 5 metrics of most environmental impacts, freshwater use, land use alterations, antibiotic use, feed conversion ratio, and greenhouse gas emissions, seafood comes out on top as least impactful. Do you know why? It's simply a more efficient protein because it floats. You and I are spending a lot of energy to keep our bodies warm. We're fighting, we're growing big bones to fight atmospheric pressure and something called gravity. And fish, hey man, I'm floating. It's an inherently more sustainable protein. And when we begin to look at the limitations, the boundaries that we as a human race are coming up against on our planet as we reach 10, maybe 12 billion people, efficiency becomes the ultimate catalyst. And as Jennifer mentioned, 71% of our planet is ocean, folks. 99% of the livable space on this planet is in the ocean. You can live in 3D in the ocean. You can live on land only so far as you can touch it. So when we think about limitations, why don't we look to the vast new economic geography that we are currently not taking best advantage of? Wild capture fisheries are essential and will be a part of our future. But aquaculture is going to be the majority of that. And we as chefs need to own that narrative. The last time we got to invent a food system was 10,000 years ago. We are in the process of inventing aquaculture as we speak. It is going to happen. What do we want that narrative to be, and how do we want it to look? But the biggest impediment to aquaculture's growth is public perception. It is a lack of social license. Social license is what is earned by an industry when a public understands the benefits that it brings to them. And it is us as chefs that can drive that conversation, as they did with fair trade coffee, as we did with local farms and all of the other campaigns that we've been a part of. So when we think about aquaculture, when we think about fisheries in general, we need to think of ourselves as being part of them. We often, I think, stand on a dock and gaze wistfully out at a wine dark sea, thinking as though a fishery is something that happens beyond the horizon of our attentions, as somewhere other than where we are. But when you stand on a dock, when you understand a fishery or a farm, you begin to understand that a fishery and a farm is the sum of the labors and aspirations of a community. And the sum of the labors and our aspirations as a community of chefs is to sustain our business, is to sustain those who sustain us, and ultimately sustain those we feed, our neighbors. And so is seafood, with which we will accomplish that. Thank you.
So much incredible impact on the plate, and I definitely want to ask you guys a couple of different questions about this, and then I want to make sure that we leave some time to be able to hear their voice in this as well. I think the industry has changed tremendously over the course of the last 5 years. I mean, I started in this, in aquaculture specifically, 10 years ago. Nobody was talking about gill tags, traceability. Seafood Watch was sort of on the radar, but maybe not quite. So I'm curious where you see things going, and certainly individually, Julie, we'll start with you on what you think the impact is going to be in terms of where this NGO space is going to play, because we're seeing almost the industry surpass that and be frustrated about trying to follow something now in a box in terms of Seafood Watch or others.
That's a really good question. It is true that the sustainable seafood movement was really started, I guess, catalyzed, as the word is, by a commitment that Walmart made to sustainable seafood. And the NGOs kind of scrambled to get fisheries that could meet that commitment into sustainable, environmental sustainable initiatives. And the NGOs are driving a lot of the change, but you're right, industry is a key component. And I think simply we have to work together. We have to actually do better together, and that's why these kind of meetings are really important. And yeah, it's a team effort. Like I said, all hands on deck. Yeah.
Shevis, I want to ask you about this because part of the frustration, I mean, I work with restaurant groups, and so I've made a commitment to Smart Catch, I've made a commitment to Seafood Watch. I have to go to the Fish Choice portal, and every single day or every single month, or God forbid, at the end of the year when I've forgotten to fill it out, I'm trying to figure out exactly how to source and what to do. And I think in some ways, you're looked at as the bad guy, because it is complicated and there are so many spaces to fill in that portal. So how are you guys, you're obviously leading the industry in terms of information, available information, and allowing us to make that choice, but how are you also engaging with the other community of distributors to help chefs like this be able to be compliant and get the information they need? Because at this point, it's all about information.
Yeah, information is key, regardless of any which way you look at it. From a distributor side, we can have these visions. We can have these, certain visions of things that we'd like to see from a sustainable perspective in our industry. But the reality is, it's up to each and every person here. It's up to the general public and the end consumer to make that final decision, to make the right choice to buy sustainable products. Because at the end of the day, we can speak sustainability till we're blue in the face, but if the end user isn't following our suggestions and our education to them, nothing's going to change. So that's all of our responsibility to make an impact, not just regionally, nationally, but on a global perspective.
That's right. And what do you do for things that are maybe more difficult to find? I mean, do you come, like chefs, I feel like the consumers have told us this is what we want to eat, but how are you making other choices and helping bring other fish to the plate through education with chefs and consumers?
That's a challenging one. Chefs like suggestions. Chefs don't like being told what to do. Am I right, chefs? So we can provide the suggestions, but it's up to the chefs to make that right decision and for them to then educate their staff, front of the house, back of the house, so it trickles down, again, to the end consumer. The end consumer drives the activity, period.
So we have to be more active consumers. And Chris, I want to ask you a question because I feel like, you and I have been in this sustainable aquaculture conversation for so long, and I always say it's the thing that gives me like the pains at night, because we know there's been a lot of bad out there, And I think it's very interesting how we were all okay and understood that there was like chicken that was farmed well and there's chicken that's farmed badly, but somehow with farmed fish, we look at it as if it's this blanket thing like all farmed is bad. So how are you guys at Pacifico? And Pacifico Aquaculture is really changing the narrative. They're the only true striped bass that's farmed in the world. Two young guys doing it, you know, so they're also really bringing this kind of modernism to this landscape. What do we do to be able to tell that story and change the narrative, particularly on menus? Because the minute we list it out as farmed, I mean, these guys are taking a hit a lot of times on what's ordered, even though 62% of what we're eating in the United States is farmed seafood.
Another great question. So farm fish has definitely earned the bad reputation that that still people perceive it as being a bad thing. 20, 30 years ago, you know, there were practices in farm fish that were unhealthy for the fish, unhealthy for the water, and created an unhealthy product for us to eat. And it's our job for companies like Pacifico Aquaculture or Verlasso Salmon, Australia's Barramundi, to convince the end consumer that farming can be done right and it can be done in a way that is actually a benefit to the water itself. So, and I feel like branding, as you mentioned, when you're putting something on the menu, people really need to know where their food is coming from. They want to know what they're putting in their body. It's difficult for the serving staff to tell the story about every product to the guest at their table, and that's why I think branding is so important. So if it says Pacifico striped bass on the menu, it's not just any striped bass, it's Pacifico. Everyone has a smartphone. They can Google Pacifico. They can go right to our website. They can see that what we're doing on the farm is really making an impact and showing that we can farm fish in a healthy way.
I'm hoping maybe you all are listening to that, because I feel like branding, we trust brands like we trust a great orchard, we trust a great farm, but for some reason, when the ethical aquaculture is asked to have their name listed on the menu, you look at it as advertising and demand a discount on the fish. I want to take a couple of questions for sure. Justin's going to come up. It's such a, again, these are very muddy waters that I'm hoping that you'll raise your hand high and maybe we can get you guys to ask a couple of questions if you'd like. Anybody have questions on sourcing, questions on farming, issues on your menu? Let's take a couple questions before we have to wrap up. We've got about 5 more minutes.
So, thanks for being here. Traditionally, we've kind of looked at and educated what to and what not to do based upon things that were endangered, right? Are there resources that we can have where we can look at predictions for species population that's maybe growing too fast and maybe start targeting the future of managing aquaculture versus just reacting to problems that are already existing?
I think that's you, Barton.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that question. And if I understood it correctly, not just how we can respond to sustainability, but to drive it, is that, and sort of understand in the future how, is that?
Yeah, and a resource like the Seafood Watch app, like where do you go to know like what's happening?
Well, I would ask Shevis. I mean, the RSVP program is really very impressive. I mean, this is something that the industry on our end to work on. This is something we need to communicate in terms of how chefs have the opportunity to invest in the future of sustainability, not just respond to it in a do no harm way. There are a couple of examples coming up in Indonesian snapper fishery, where there's a campaign that the Nature Conservancy is running, where it's trying to get chefs to use snapper that are large and to do portions rather than entire fillets, because a fillet fish hasn't had the chance to reproduce yet. And it's only chefs' demand for a plate-sized fillet that's preventing these fish from being valuable. And so we need to do a better job. But there is also RSVP programs, there's Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, and the best is through Monterey Bay Seafood Watch program, where a lot of this information does filter.
It's somewhat complicated, I know, to use the app, but the reality is whenever I have a question for a client and I'm trying to source or even figure out retroactively what's not on the invoice, my first stop is with the app. And so I get online, get on the computer, but I mean, it's true, you've got to do some research on it, and unfortunately, that's why we're saying you have to be very active consumers at this point. I believe that more and more distributors are going to help us. There's going to be a lot of more information that's coming on the invoicing, but that's not going to change unless you demand it. So that information should be coming from the person that sold it to you with certifications and the background if you asked for it to know exactly where it was coming from. Not always easy. Yep. Okay, so it looks like we're out of time. I will wait up here. We're really happy to take other questions if you'd like. I think the main takeaway for us is you really can be a catalyst for change. This is a space that demands and needs you and is begging for your active participation. So we thank you so much for listening to us today, and we hope that in the future you'll think about this as you're making your fish and seafood order. Have a great day, guys. Bye.
Yeah, please make some noise for our amazing guests. As you're here, you are welcome to go enjoy our sustainable seafood lunch. We are also about to begin a whole swordfish breakdown. This swordfish will also appear as soon as it's broken down at Chef Roy Villacruz's station down at the Sustainable Seafood and Plant Forward Lunch. Thank you all very much.
And actually verifying what it is when
He opened up on Peak.
You did? Oh.